Hello, hello. This is on. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the Social and Online Games Summit. Thanks for coming. Hope you had a really good day yesterday. I'm Jen Steele. I'm the conference manager of all of the summits that are going on today and yesterday here at GDC. And I am thrilled and very pleased to introduce our second keynote for the summit, Mr. Christian Siegerstrahl, the co-founder and CEO of Playfish. Everybody give him a welcome.
Jen. So my name is Christian Siegerstrahl. I am the co-founder and CEO of Playfish. Now, of course, the VP and general manager of the Playfish business unit inside EA, looking after the social games effort for Electronic Arts. So the topic of my talk today is the relentless march toward free and what it means to the games industry. We saw a lot of good talks and panels yesterday on social games and what makes a great social game today, some of the industry trends, who are the players, what's Facebook doing right now, and so we had a fantastic, I think, snapshot of social games as an industry. At the same time, I think this year is very much an inflection point, certainly in social gaming and arguably in the broader games market, where perhaps some of the lessons that we've learned in social gaming and some of the, if you like, practices of how we make and operate social games actually make their way toward some of the broader game industry. So what I wanted to do this morning was to talk about what do those things that we've learned in social games over the past 2 years, what do they mean for the broader games industry? What do we expect to be some of the success factors of how should we think about building our companies moving forward to be ready for where the broader games industry is heading? And also, what are the likely trends as a result? What are we likely to see in the industry, and what are we likely to see moving forward as companies and as an industry together? So, but first a little bit about me. I'm a games entrepreneur. I was a founder of a mobile games company in 2001, which is now called Glue Mobile. I was the co-founder of a European half of that company. Spent 6 years building out a mobile games business. Went through a pretty successful IPO in 2007. I then left about a quarter after that in order to set up Playfish. And Playfish is a social games company. Really what we set out to do was observing the launch or the phenomenal success of Facebook and the launch of the Facebook platform. What we wanted to do was to go out and change or evolve how people play games. To go and create games where people play because they can play together, where we create experiences which are social and connected instead of those kind of standalone experiences which were still mainstream in the game market at that point in time, certainly the online game market. And we were very inspired by what Nintendo had done in the console market of marketing experiences not through showing a bunch of screenshots of aliens and monsters and big explosions and sort of you versus that imaginary world, but rather turning the camera around and showing the family playing together or friends playing together, because that's ultimately a more compelling reason to play games. So we're very, very inspired by that, but also inspired by companies like YouTube, who had taken something that was done online in a pretty clumsy way previously and made it very sleek, made it a very good user experience to watch video online. So we set out to evolve how the world plays games by creating these social and connected experiences. We started by launching Who Has the Biggest Brain? That was our first title. We set up the company in October 2007. We launched Who Has the Biggest Brain in December. I think it was pretty much Christmas Eve, as far as I can remember, when we finally got that title out. And it's kind of interesting. It was a competitive brain training title. It was a great place to start. What happens when you create a brain training title which is predominantly about competition between friends? Well, we now can actually answer that question. One, we got more than 20 million people to play it, which is pretty cool. But also it's been played more than half a billion times, rather. So your average game player, including those who hated the game, have played 25 times. Not because they loved the game so much, but out of principle, because they couldn't stand the fact that their sister or brother or husband or wife had a higher score than they did. It was an interesting lesson in building social games. But since then, we released altogether 12 titles. We today have 2 titles which are bigger than World of Warcraft in audience terms. Pet Society with about 20 million monthly active users, and Restaurant City today with about 16 million monthly active users. We're live on Facebook, but also on a bunch of other social networks like MySpace, like Bebo. We've tried out some launches on mobile, on the iPhone and on Android. But the vast majority of our traffic is on Facebook today. We have offices in London, which is our headquarters where I'm based. We also have an office in Beijing in China, in Norway, as well as one here in San Francisco. And we're growing pretty fast right now. We combined with EA in November last year, and we continue to grow very quickly and continue to be very excited to be part of the broader EA family, and both growing faster as well as being able to look at some of the bigger opportunities in the market that I'll talk about today. So that's as much as I want to talk about Playfish really today, because what I want to get onto is the evolution of the industry. Because we are in the middle of this tectonic plate shift, if you like, as a broader games industry. We've gone through a whole bunch of platform transitions before. New technology is nothing new to us. We've gone from CGA to VGA to SVGA. We've gone from home consoles to PCs to even faster home consoles. We've gone from normal resolution to HD. We've done a bunch of technology transitions in the past. But what's going on right now is a transition which is a little bit more fundamental than that. We're moving as an industry. In fact, before we've only changed what the product looks like to the consumer, the technology behind the products, by making them, by being able to have more computing power or faster graphics. What we are now experiencing is in fact a change or an evolution in how we interface to our players, in how we deliver our entertainment experience to our players. The kind of things which are happening is and ultimately all of this is driven by connectivity behind the scenes. It's driven by the internet, it's driven by connectivity between people, and to some degree social networks, but it really is the internet. We are moving from delivering products which are physical to delivering products which are digital. It's a different way of transporting, if you like, the product, but it's also more fundamental than that, because the minute that a product is fully digital, we're able to change it after it's been released. We're actually able to patch it. We're able to launch more content for it. We're able to create experiences which we hadn't even thought of when we initially launched the game. And that happens both, at one extreme on social networks, at the other extreme on consoles. That also means that we're moving as an industry from being a product-driven industry to being a service-driven industry, with a very fundamental change in economics that come with that. As opposed to investing up front to create a product that we effectively fire and forget, we get it out there, we market it, we see how it does. If it does well, we create a sequel. We're increasingly moving to a place where the value that we provide to the consumer comes increasingly not just from that single standalone product, but from all the services that we provide after they get their hands on the product itself. Whether it's services through community or whether it's services through downloadable content or through other things that we can provide as developers. And that fundamentally changes how we interface to our players. Our product is becoming increasingly social, increasingly less standalone. Because as every console is connected, as every game experience becomes connected, the bulk of the reason why you play starts becoming not just what you are doing in the game, but rather what everybody else is doing and how you fit into that community. And those social experiences range all the way from, if you like, vertical social experiences in games like World of Warcraft, where you meet a bunch of people and you play together with them, all the way to these ultra-horizontal experiences on social networks, where the main experience of playing the game is socializing with friends as opposed to necessarily even thinking too much about the game itself. But those three things, what they are leading to is a fundamental evolution in business models for us. Before, we only used to be able to charge a single price for a single type of product out there. We get people to pay up front predominantly, and we have a singular product that we sell to them. With the industry becoming digital, we're increasingly able to be flexible. It gives us the flexibility of choosing to either get consumers to pay everything up front, pay a small proportion up front, pay something over time like a subscription or microtransactions, or perhaps even give the product entirely out for free and let people then pay for it through microtransactions or subscriptions or any other ongoing business model. And it's that economic shift, if you like, it's that shift of business models which I want to focus on today, because it has some profound implications in how the industry evolves moving forward. And most fundamentally, I think it really does revolutionize how we think about our relationship between us, the publishers, the developers, and the players out there. And I think that's applicable across every platform, and it's something that we've learned in social games very much over the past 2 years. So part of the inspiration of the topic for this talk was actually a quote by Chris Anderson, whose thesis was that every industry that becomes digital eventually becomes free. And he based that on the fact that computing power, storage, and bandwidth all are trending toward, the cost of providing those things is trending towards zero. and hence, because the marginal cost of providing a service using those things, i.e. a digital service, becomes close to zero, hence most industries will profit from being able to offer some kind of a product for free and then upselling things over time. I don't know if that's true for every industry, but it certainly does give us flexibility. It does give us the option as an industry to provide things for free and to that way lower the barriers for entry to become players. Free hasn't been a particularly popular word in the games industry in the past. It's a four-letter word, for one. And also, we equate free with things like piracy, with things like illegal file sharing and people somehow getting something they shouldn't be getting because they didn't pay for it. And in fact, if you look at some of the newspaper headlines right now about the broader games industry, there's some pretty big headlines around things like free games on the internet are killing the console market. Free, and if you think of the music industry, they've struggled with finding a new business model which would help generate revenues from the free consumption of music as music has gone digital. So there's a lot of worry about this idea of the industry becoming free, and certainly a lot of analysts and journalists out there are tagging onto that. But what I'll actually argue is that far from being a threat to our industry, free and the lowering of barriers in the industry is actually by far the biggest growth opportunity we have as an industry across any platform over the next 5 years. Because it allows us not only to bring in new consumers to the industry, but because it allows us to interface with those consumers differently in such a way that we're able to maximize or understand who's who out of our consumers and be able to maximize our relationship with them over time. But before I talk about that, let's rewind a little bit and talk about the past. Most of the time when people talk about the growth of the computer games industry, we tend to see this kind of a graph. This is NPD data, by the way, so US game revenue in particular, and then you see sort of overlaid pictures of platforms. Because as an industry, we've grown through new platforms predominantly. Every time we launch a new console, we see this growth spurt coming from that, and then 5 years later or sometime later, we see a new growth spurt. So ranging from the left, from 1995 or so, the PlayStation 1, all the way to PlayStation 2 and the Xbox in 1999, 2000, and then the latest generation of consoles in the sort of 2004, 2005 type range. And actually a lot of the big peak there to the right has been driven by Nintendo and some genius products like Wii Fit, where it is about the game, but it's also equally about you getting fit. So in general, we've done incredibly well as an industry so far in terms of growing over the past 15 years by launching new platforms and hit titles and figuring out new types of games that people like. But there's actually a different way to tell this story. If you, instead of thinking about a timeline and revenue and platforms that way, what if we think about access barriers and audience? And I've got audience in this kind of logarithmic scale here. If you start plotting the consoles on this type of a graph, actually what we've been doing over the past few years has been to launch consoles which are increasingly, and games critically, which are increasingly accessible, where the barriers to entry, out of which price, by the way, is an important one, but by no means the only one, can be things like how complicated the controller is, how long it takes you to read the 50-page manual before you get into the game itself. So it's an evolution both in price points, but also in game design and controllers and interfaces in these games. So over time, we've been able to offer experiences which are lower and lower in their barriers to entry, and hence have been able to get more and more people involved in those games. And as you move to the right on this graph, you have lower cost, typically games which are more social, typically games which are more immediate, where you don't have to wait for a long loading time, and you can play them more impulsively. You can just pick up your phone and buy the game and play it, have to worry about buying a console for home. And also more real. Increasingly, I used Wii Fit just now as an example, but also social games or games on social networks are another example of real. This idea that playing the game itself has an impact on your real world life somehow. Gareth talked about this yesterday in his online-offline interaction, that when you play the game and actually it means something in your personal life. Or you play Wii Fit and you're playing it not just because of the game, but also because you want to get fit. Or you play Rock Band not just because of the game, but because you want to have fun and sort of make music with friends. So that's another way of looking at how the industry has evolved today. In general, looking at parallel industries, what we see going on here is a gradual lowering of barriers to entry, to consumption in the industry, and as a result, a rapid growth in the total addressable audience for the industry. We're not the only industry going through this kind of sort of transition, if you like, this kind of evolution over time. In fact, in those same 15 years that it took us as a games industry to grow here in the US from about 3 or 4 billion in value to about 20 billion in value, actually the internet has grown from 16 million users, imagine it, that sort of in the 1994, I think that data point is from, to about 1.8 billion users today. And interestingly, those 1.8 billion users are obviously not as hardcore as all the guys who were happy to use these BBSs and all the funky monochrome type interfaces. But they nevertheless are today part of the industry because we've been able to lower the cost of internet access. We've also been able to lower or ease, if you like, make using the internet easier and faster. We've come up with products like Google, which enables us to find things on the internet, which used to be a nightmare in the past. So all those things have lowered the barriers to adoption, and lo and behold, we've gone from 16 million users of effectively an information service that can kind of get us information to 1.8 billion users in 15 years. It's pretty staggering, really, and that number keeps on growing. To use another example, online video here in the US has in a few short years grown from nothing to about 150 million monthly unique users. That's been largely driven by YouTube. I don't know how many of you guys remember what online video was like before YouTube. It's kind of difficult to remember because you didn't really use it very much. It was a small window somewhere which told you that you didn't have the right codec most of the time. But YouTube, what it did for online video was the sense that it was easy, it was quick, everybody understood how to use it, plus you could obviously contribute your own videos to it, making it a far more accessible service. Who would have thought that video and watching video and contributing video to the internet would be something that 150 million unique users would do in the US? That's a staggering number. And if you think of that and you look at, let's look at the social gaming number. Here we saw this, we heard it from Gareth yesterday, 200 million monthly uniques play games on Facebook today, out of 400 million uniques in total. Given that Facebook sort of targets just about everybody out there, that's a staggering number. Half of Facebook's monthly uniques are playing games today. Given how accessible these different, like the internet has become and online video has become, I think this is only the beginning to the amount of people we can get involved in computer games moving forward. Because we are going down that same curve. It's still not as easy and as simple. You still, to be one of these 200 million people, you actually need to be on Facebook. As Facebook is growing, as other social networks grow, as the internet grows, there's a fantastic opportunity for growth for us as an industry. So in many ways, what Facebook has done is done for online games and for free-to-play games exactly what YouTube did for online video. It was possible to play free-to-play games online, and there was a pretty decent industry around that before Facebook. But what Facebook has done has been to lower the barriers to adopt gaming, to play these games in such a way that we suddenly have gone from nothing to 200 million players in 2 years. And that continues to grow. Given that, I think it's useful when we think about where the broader game industry is going next. It's useful to look at what are the underpinnings of those barriers that Facebook have lowered as a platform. Because, as we said, it's certainly not price, because these games used to be free to play even before. So what have Facebook done? Well, as we heard from Gareth yesterday, the fundamentals of what they've done has actually been to provide us as developers and publishers access to your friends. We get access to your friend relationships, your social graph, if you like. We get your friends' pictures. We get some other information that we might want, some information about you as a player, if you want to use that. And we're able to create gaming experiences using that information, which have lower barriers to entry than free-to-play games used to have. Why is that? Well, the first and foremost, we can actually create games where the primary emotional reason why people play is to play together with friends. It is about a social experience. It's about competition, cooperation, self-expression, and 1,000 other more complicated social emotions which have to do with how we interface to our friends and family. And those are far more compelling reasons to play than that solitary journey through a quest that some game designer has written to, even written very well and creatively. Still, if you can somehow use that experience to interface to your real-world friends, to socialize with your friends, that actually turns out to be a far more attractive proposition for the vast majority of people. So the first thing that Facebook have done had been to enable this sense of social gaming, this sense of playing with friends, just like you play Wii Sports with friends or Rock Band or other those kind of titles with friends, or cards or board games for that matter. But the second thing, which is slightly more nuanced, but which is arguably at least as important, if not more important, is that they've created a social platform online which allows friends to tell each other what they are doing outside of that social network or inside of games, for example. And that fact, the fact that you can post feed stories from games, you can send invites from games, you can send notifications, or you can no longer send notifications, but you used to be able to send notifications. You can in other ways interact with your friends outside of the game itself, means that you as a player, suddenly when you say you're doing something, don't just reach the other people who are already playing that game or who are already playing games or already have an Xbox and are on Xbox Live or whatever, but you actually reach everybody, including your mum and your sister and your cousin and your colleagues at work. And those guys are interested in who you are by definition because they are one of your friends. So they will look at what you've done and hence be able to react to that and perhaps try out whatever it is that you're doing, just so you'll have something to talk about the next day. And that core ability has actually created an entirely new discipline of game design, which takes game design out of what's going on inside the game experience itself, and rather, as designers, we try to think, how do we take that experience, how do we create an experience where people will want to talk about the game and want to interface to each other outside of the game in such a way as to bring more people into the game and reactivate each other in the game. And one example of that is, here's a feed from one of our games, Restaurant City, where it ultimately is really about collecting recipes, and the only way you can get them is really through trading with friends. So what do? You go out and you shout out to all your friends saying, I need some beef and I need a potato and whatnot. And those type of experiences are taking an increasingly bigger and bigger role in game design for social networks, because by using this platform that social networks have created of being able to talk to your friends, also those people who don't play games, means that we can create this social distribution cycle, if you like, where we are able to get new people involved in the game who are interested in the game because of socializing, because of playing with friends, rather than because of the game itself. So for the first time as an industry, what we're able to do is we're able to bring games to where people hang out and not require people to identify themselves as gamers. We don't ask you to say, I'd love to buy a game, hence where am I going to get the game from? I'm going to go to a game shop, or I'm going to go online to a portal or to somewhere else and then get hold of that game. All we are asking is that as you socialize with your friends and you see that one of your friends is doing something interesting, you might want to check it out. Huge difference in barrier to adoption, as witnessed by 200 million uniques every month right now. So this sense of reaching friends as opposed to reaching gamers has had an enormously powerful effect. And this is really critical, that these barriers to entry is not just about price. Price is part of it. But really, what's happened in social games is this sense of social adoption of gaming, because you find these games through friends. The other interesting thing is, and this is a little bit more on the supply side, if you like, we've become a global market overnight. Previous to doing social games, as I mentioned, I spent 6 years building a mobile games company, which is also digital, also right at the forefront of where games are going. There I spent most of my time building distribution, setting up offices in different countries in order to be able to build carrier distribution in different countries. Even though the product was digital, you had to still distribute in a very traditional way through distributors. On social networks, that's not the case. Because people find these products through their friends, there is no distribution tier, which means that we've become global literally overnight. And what's interesting is that the games that people play on these social networks anywhere You look at some of the popular games on Renren in China. You look at the popular games on Facebook, on VKontakte in Russia. It is literally the same types of games. You have a global market of players who play the same types of games on social networks. And it's really staggering. We've suddenly created this completely international global market overnight. Another one of those lowering of barriers for this industry. And the coolest thing about all of this stuff is that we've reduced the barriers. We give the product, the gameplay experience away for free. And still, as we heard yesterday, this year as an industry, social gaming will generate somewhere around $1 billion in revenue. For an industry that's only really a year and a half or 2 years old in terms of its learnings about monetization, that's a pretty staggering amount. And that's bearing in mind that I believe we barely scratched the surface of really understanding what drives our users and their behavior. Really how to optimize something like a payment flow in the best possible way in some of the faraway countries where people are playing these games and we still haven't quite figured out how to get those guys to pay in the best possible way. So the fact that we're able to generate call it about $1 billion in revenue this year from 200 million uniques, I think is only the beginning, because already here we have so much learning to do. I mean, we learn something new every day. I'm sure all of my colleagues in the industry learn something new every day through innovation, through observing each other. And that pace of evolution is such that I believe that even if we didn't increase the user base, we'd have plenty of room to grow as an industry. And what's best is that user base is actually likely to continue to grow very, very rapidly indeed over the next couple of years. So that's some of the things that have happened on the consumer side of things. And again, it's worth paying attention to this, because when you think about what's happening in the future of the game industry, I think a lot of these lessons are very applicable. So when we think about what's actually happened on the production side, on our side, if you like, of the industry, of how we actually make games, that's actually transformed quite dramatically too. And it's driven by this sense of evolution through generations. We allegedly evolved from apes to humans in about 500,000 or so generations. By every generation adapting a little bit better to the environment that we were in and being able to survival of the fittest and all that. In lots of ways, it's equivalent to what's going on in the games industry. If you think of a franchise like FIFA, which has been around for a long time, has evolved in 17 years through about 21 generations or so. That's at least how many I could count. Where every generation tries to figure out, what did we do last time that we could do better this time around? What customer feedback did we get? How can we market this thing better? How can we just make a better product and a better experience? Now, in social games and in any gaming environment, or games as a service, this process gets exponentially faster. In fact, Pet Society, for example, which is our biggest game, has in its 1.5 years of lifespan undergone well over 100 generations in terms of reacting, observing gameplay, looking at data, reacting to how we think we can make the game a little bit better, deploying that change, putting it out, observing again how things are going. In some cases, devising experiments in such a way that you can monitor different behaviors at the same time. And that has led to product evolution, which is at hyperspeed. In fact, and the interesting thing is this evolution hasn't necessarily led to 3D graphics and bigger explosions and more complicated games. In fact, quite the opposite. Many times this evolution actually means buttons being taken away from the UI. The overall experience becoming simpler, more easy to understand early on in the game experience, while becoming richer later on in the game experience. So a lot of the things that you see in games are not at all obvious. It's not that you make the game add content to the game necessarily. It's that you tweak it based on how your gamers experience it. And this is pretty fundamental, because what this has generated, if you like, is it's generated an entirely new discipline in how to make games. I call these guys the quants. We have a whole bunch of these guys at Playfish. I know there's a ton of them in other companies in the industry. But these people are the guys who are experts at taking out data, understanding data, if you like, instrumenting games in such a way that you can understand what's going on in that game, analyze that data, interpret it, and plow it back into a game design decision. Game designers will always be needed, but this is a discipline which has been rising both in quantity of these people, but also in their influence over the industry. Because you can argue over designs, you cannot argue over data. Once the data tells you your feature is not being used, no matter how much everybody agrees that it's a fantastic feature, it's not working. So this data-driven approach to evolving games at a hyper speed also has led to an environment of hyper competition. Here's an example of games where when we can of course observe our own data in the industry. We can also observe everybody else's data because the platforms are transparent that way. We actually know how many daily active users every game has on Facebook because Facebook publishes that data. So that means we can react not only to our innovations, but we can also react to our peers' innovations in the market. And we can react at hyper speed because all these companies are wired to execute and drive generations week by week by week. Which means that you've had a massive amount of games which are quite similar to each other in categories which are proven successful. Here's probably the most famous example between Farmtown and Farmville. But what you don't see, and what I think is actually far more fundamental, is that evolution actually takes place every week. Everybody conducts experiments every week on some aspect of game flow or virality or engagement or monetization in games. Everybody observes everybody else's experiments and tries to divine if they were successful or not, and then bakes that into their next generation thinking. What are they going to do? Not next year or next month, but next week. That hyper-competitive environment has been one of the key drivers, quite frankly, why we've evolved so quickly as an industry today. So those are some of the things which have happened on the supply side of the industry. It's important also to note what did not happen. For one, blockbusters didn't die. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 last year was one of the biggest entertainment, in fact the biggest entertainment launch ever at that point in time. Followed obviously now by Avatar in the movies. But blockbusters didn't die. We continue to have console blockbusters despite 200 million monthly uniques playing social games. Similarly, destination sites didn't die. Yahoo Games, Pogo.com, Miniclip. None of these sites have suddenly tanked overnight. People play games both in social networks and on destination sites. And clearly profitability didn't die overnight. Despite us offering a free product online, we've created a very profitable industry for its size. And overall, we haven't killed anything. I think all those newspaper headlines talking about how social games are killing this or killing that, it's just not true. We haven't killed anything. In fact, we've been hugely additive to the industry. I think what's exciting and what's interesting is that if you look at us in context of other industries, the DVD didn't kill movies. The personal video recorder did not kill DVDs. Television hasn't killed anything. In fact, typically in media, when you add a new type of access device to that media, it adds to the total value of the whole industry. And that's probably the single biggest takeaway for me from observing social games over the past 2 years. So what do we believe is going to happen next, based on what we've seen over the past 2 years? And borrowing some from my mobile game experience before then. Well, let's go back to this demand curve of these different platforms. Right now, we operate as a business as a price times quantity type business, so at least at the top end of this curve, where we try to sell a singular product at a specific price and we try to maximize the amount of units that we sell. At the bottom of this curve, or at the base of this pyramid, if you like, of players, we actually focus on something completely different. We focus on generating engagement and generating lifetime value from those players. So in a weird way, despite us being one industry, we are operating with two completely different business models. I think as games move more to having a bigger and bigger service component over time, we will actually see an increasingly less focus on this price times quantity model out there, and more focus on a lifetime value model. Because regardless if you charge for something up front or not, ultimately what you're interested in is how much, from your relationship with that consumer, how can you make sure that that consumer likes your product enough to contribute revenue to you as much as possible during their lifetime of being your consumer. So in fact, what I believe is the biggest single driver of how we will evolve as a broader game industry, not just as a social game industry, but as a broader game industry, is actually that we'll move away our focus from thinking about siloed different platforms, console gaming, mobile gaming, social gaming, whatnot, and instead focus on the consumer. Because what we really have here is a continuum of consumers with different preferences. We have consumers who have, at the far left of the curve, who are perfectly willing to pay tens of thousands of dollars to be part of a game experience every year because they love it so much. It's so important to them. Right at the other end, you have people who might just be able to part with 10 cents if they find something super valuable to them in that game experience. And all of these consumers are persistently connected. These guys are, by the way, the internet audience today, and that's growing quickly. It's bigger even if you take all mobile users into account. But these guys are all persistently connected across all the devices that they use. They are socially networked, increasingly on one social network or another. If it's not Facebook, it's some other social network. And they have this pyramid of preferences, if you like. It's not that one person either plays a free-to-play game online or a mobile game or a console game. Instead, we have people who are simply more or less interested or more or less willing to invest their time and money into games. And at the far left of this, you have people who play games on 10 different platforms, some of which are the same franchises, some are different franchises, some are new things, some are old things. And at the other end, you have somebody who may just discover that game on one platform and leave it there. So when you think about the industry this way, instead of thinking about the platforms, what do we think that means in terms of future success factors? How do we tackle that? How do we, as an industry, satisfy the needs of these consumers, and how do we grow as a result? Well, I think a couple of things jump out. One, the ability to create high-quality experiences will be more important than ever. There may have been a time when we as an industry were able to create a pretty bad product and market it really well and sell a lot of units because we could kind of fire and forget as an industry. I think that age is over anyway. But if it wasn't over, it definitely will be over moving forward, because all of these connected consumers who are socially networked will tell their friends if they don't like an experience. Trying to market your way to success with a bad quality product is simply not going to work moving forward on any platform, I believe. Equally, when we think about how we're going to address that whole spectrum of consumers, I think it's going to be increasingly important to be able to offer experiences multi-platform. That when you have a franchise, you have an entertainment experience that a consumer loves, it's going to be more and more important to make sure that that experience can be consumed on as many devices in as many different ways as possible in order to maximize the value, if you like, of the franchise that you're creating, regardless if you're creating that on the social network or if you created that on any other platform. Understanding of players and sort of social, if you like, in quotes. What I mean by that is all this stuff that we've been learning over the past 2 years in social games in terms of iterating based on data, understanding who players are, what they are likely to do next, understanding leading indicators of behavior. If somebody ends up doing something specific in a game, what does that mean in terms of, what does that predict in terms of what they are likely to do next? Understanding our players and understanding how they interface to each other, how they interact with each other socially, is going to be critical, not just on social network, but also on other platforms. Because as we've seen, recommendations from friends and how people perceive this idea of playing with their friends is so important, is such an important and valuable part of their entertainment experience. So no matter what platform you're on, it's something that you've got to understand, or that is a key success factor, I believe, moving forward, in whether you're successful or not. And finally, ownership of franchises. So far, if you look at the top end of this kind of continuum of consumers, franchises dominate. They dominate console platforms and mobile platforms these days. What's interesting about the social games and the free-to-play games arena is that there's actually hardly any franchises there. I think in the top 20 games on social networks right now, I think Bejeweled Blitz is there, and that's the only existing game franchise from elsewhere that you'll find. Is that likely to continue? So I believe not, because all other things equal, consumers tend to prefer franchises or prefer experiences which they know and trust and love from somewhere else. And to perhaps illustrate that story, let me borrow back from my, if you like, my old days at mobile. If you're looking at the iPhone as a game platform, when it got launched, or the iPhone, the App Store rather on the iPhone got launched, it got launched as the most democratic game platform in the world. Here's a game platform and you can produce games quite cheaply. Anyone can make them, anyone can upload them, get them certified, get them sold. As a result, we had some fantastic applications and games being generated in the first couple of weeks. And in fact, the top paid for app in July 2008 was iBeer by Hotix Entertainment. Fantastic application. A lot of people downloaded it and paid for it because they wanted that specific entertainment experience. The top paid app of 2008, this actually features some pretty funky 3D graphics already. This is an application called Koi Pond by the Blimp Pilots. Again, you could kind of touch the surface of this water and the fish would come to you, and it's kind of cool. I mean, a lot of people paid for that entertainment experience. So, but again, I mean, not to disrespect this, because I actually think it's a really important part of the game industry. These type of very, very shallow entertainment experiences, I actually think are really, really important part of our future. But I think what happened over time in this, in fact, pretty rapidly, if you think about, that was 2008. What happened in 2009? Well, the top grossing app was actually The Sims 3. If we look at the top 10 games or top 10 applications on the iPhone, top 8 were games, which is great news for everybody here. But out of those top 8 games, 7 were existing franchises. So in 1 year, we went from iBeer and Koi Pond to The Sims 3 and Call of Duty, World at War, Zombies, Assassin's Creed 2 and Madden and whatnot. That is because all other things equal. Initially, on any new platform expertise matters. It matters the most. You need to understand the consumer, you need to understand how to create experiences for that specific platform. But over time, as that knowledge of the platform becomes more democratized, and even the big guys, if you like, catch on to what that platform is about, then ultimately it's all about customer acquisition cost and lifetime value, even in a price times quantity like market. And there, it is easier, faster, and cheaper to acquire consumers if you already have a brand, because all other things equal, if you have a consumer in front of a shelf, be it digital or real, people will tend to gravitate toward the franchises they know. So hence, I think the likelihood of franchises being big on social networks is pretty big. And by the way, it doesn't mean that it won't be possible to continue to build franchises on social networks. Arguably, Pet Society or Farmville or other successful games on social networks are already franchises in their own right. Not to say you won't be able to do that, but that franchises from elsewhere will also be important on the platform. So what does that mean in terms of likely industry trends? Where do we believe, based on what we've seen happen in social games, based on what we sort of expect to happen, or what we think are the success factors moving forward, what do we think is going to happen? Well, the first thing is, surprise, surprise, franchises on social networks. In fact, I believe that in 3 years' time, more than half of the top 10 on Facebook will actually be franchises from elsewhere. Now, the great news is probably half will be homegrown franchises on social networks, which is unlike many other platforms. But we will see franchises on social networks in a big way. Not just from us, but also from a whole bunch of you guys out there, I believe. The second thing that I believe we'll see is significant consolidation in what today is called the social games sector. What was interesting again in both mobile games and iPhone games was that early on in the platform, because the successful titles tend to be new IP, they tend to be dominated by new things, by new companies, and there are usually these myths that get created, or mostly founded on reality of those two guys in the garage who made $1 million by creating, whether it was iBeer or Koi Pond. And that then leads to a bunch of investment coming into the industry, a bunch of hype of, hey, this is entirely new, entirely different from anything else we've seen anywhere else. It's going to be hyper profitable and different from any other bit of the game industry. What then tends to happen is, slowly but surely, that industry gets more and more connected to the broader game industry, and some of those initial companies make it very big and are very successful, and others get consolidated either into the existing players or into some of the broader games companies. We'd expect the same thing to happen in social games, because as we've seen, social games are a fantastically exciting part of the broader game industry. But just that. They are not some entirely new, totally different thing that will be governed by completely different rules than the rest of the game industry. They are, to me, by far the biggest growth opportunity moving forward, but they will also be impacted by the same rules and by the same success factors as the rest of the industry. And that, I believe, is going to drive consolidation moving forward. So we'll see social game makers today being snapped up by console publishers. We'll see them being snapped up by each other. And we're going to see an interesting, I think, evolution in perceived valuations moving forward in the market. Because we certainly have had a lot of froth in that market previously. And I think while this is an important, incredible part of the game industry, it still is just that. So consolidation overall in what today are called social games. Thirdly, I think we'll actually forget in the next 3 to 5 years, sometime between 3 to 5 years from now, nobody will utter the words social games. Because social features are being plugged into every game on every platform, and it's just a continuum of games on consoles which have social features all the way to completely free-to-play games on the internet which have social features which may or may not be on Facebook, might be using Facebook Connect. In fact, I think in sort of 3 to 5 years' time, saying I'm developing a social game is going to be like saying I have an electric television at home. It kind of is a given. It's unlikely to be steam-driven or some other form of television. So social really, I think, is pretty ubiquitous. It's going to be out there across all platforms, which is also why I think, by the way, that there's so much to learn from what today is the social game market to the rest of games. But finally, innovation and growth. I think when viewing those negative headlines out in the industry today about how, social is killing console and I don't know who's killing somebody else, what we seem to forget is that we've somehow collectively, the makers of social games and Facebook together and other social networks, have brought over 200 million monthly new unique game players into the game industry. I mean, what an opportunity that is for us as an industry to innovate and to obviously make these guys happier and get them to stay and invite their friends, but also to get these guys introduced to more immersive gaming experiences. If you remember that example of the internet, if you would have asked again in the mid-90s how many people are going to use this thing in the future, which seemed like quite a hardcore experience, inaccessible experience of being able to log into a BBS and download some cheats to some games, probably you would have thought this is probably a pretty niche product. I think the same, whereas the internet is clearly incredibly mass market, same with online video. I think the biggest opportunity for us is to use this lowering of barriers that social networks have helped us create for our players to not just create an enormously profitable and successful and growing what today is called social gaming market, a free-to-play market, but also learn about these players and learn their preferences and learn ways to migrate these guys up into deeper gaming, more immersive game experiences. Once they learn to interact with a franchise, they may well see the value in buying not just digital goods and digital things which enhance their experience, but also additional gaming experiences on other platforms. And that's personally why I'm so incredibly excited about where the industry is right now. I think we've barely scratched the surface of what we can do together to satisfy the needs of those today 200 million monthly uniques, God knows how many, in 6 months or 12 months' time. And I think that's why whatever your platform is today, whether you are a mobile games developer, you're a console games developer, you're a online MMO developer, or a social game developer, I think the biggest opportunity toward the future is really to focus on the needs of these consumers and figure out how do we make sure that these guys are all become part of the broader game industry in such a way that the next 3 to 5 to 7 years are going to see the same kind of growth as the game industry, if not more rapid acceleration of growth than what we've seen in the past couple of years. So with that, I'd like to say thanks and open it up for questions. The microphone is there to the left if anybody's got any questions.
Hi. Can you talk a little bit about dual economies in social games?
The question is, can I talk about dual economies in social games? I presume you mean dual currencies, like attention-based currencies and cash currencies. So I'm not the subject matter expert in dual currencies, but suffice it to say that clearly it makes sense to have dual currencies in games because it's important on the one hand to be able to reward players with attention currency. So by the way, for those of you guys who are not initiated in dual currencies, it's the idea that in a game you both have some kind of coins that you can earn or buy, and then you have some other currency like gems, for example, which you can only purchase. And the advantage of having dual currencies is that you can have one currency which you can earn and you can provide players incentives to do new things in that game and earn coins as a result, while not necessarily affecting or worrying about inflation across the whole economy because you still have that cash currency which won't suffer from that inflation as a result of attention-based currencies.
Thanks.
Hi. It sounds like you're saying that this space is going to be dominated by franchises over the next few years. Do you see a space, a place for indie developers in this?
So the question is, do I see the space being dominated by franchises and do I see a space for indie developers? I absolutely see a space for indie developers. There is a ton of innovation left to be done in this market. It cannot be that the dominant category in this gaming is farming for forever, right? I mean, there's got to be other categories of games that should be interesting on this platform. And by the way, as I said, I think franchises will be important. I think there will be a substantial part of the top 10. I continue to believe it's possible to create new IP on social networks that will make its way onto other platforms over time. Next question.
Yeah, I'm curious if there are things that you would like to see Facebook and other social networks do to continue to support the growth of the industry moving forward.
Okay, so the question is, what would I like to see Facebook and other social networks do in order to help the growth of the industry? Well, as far as Facebook goes, we've actually been huge fans from the start of Facebook and how they've evolved their platform. I think they've struck a very, very good balance of always protecting the consumer experience on the platform while nurturing the games ecosystem. And I think because ultimately our biggest collective, if you like, the biggest danger in the Facebook games market was always, what if consumers end up seeing the whole platforms as spam? Because if the consumers hate the experience on the platform, then none of us stand a chance. So we've always been consistently huge supporters of all the efforts to clean up the experience, to reduce the amount of unwanted spam by players, to make sure that overall consumer experience is great behind the scenes. And we are also supporters of all the efforts behind credits and other things which will enhance, if you like, and make it easier to be a developer and publisher on the platform. So I think as far as Facebook is concerned, I think they've done a great job at evolving the platform in a good direction. So long as they keep that up, I think that's great. As for other social networks, please be more like Facebook.
Okay, thank you.
I've always thought of the franchise advantage as being a solution to the limited shelf space problem, which in retail was shelf, and then on traditional mobile it's the deck, and iPhone it's really the top 10 list, even though it's digital. So because Facebook really has a unique discovery mechanism, do you really... I just wondered if you could comment on that. I would have thought that the discovery mechanism being so unique would kill the advantage of the franchise.
Yeah. So I think that's a great point. So because social discovery, because you discover games through friends, arguably you could say that some of that source of trust that a brand normally would give you, when you choose something from a shelf, isn't really there because the trust comes from the friend, right? So you kind of get recommended something from two friends, you're very likely to at least check it out, especially since the cost of adoption isn't that high. So I agree with that, and I think that's why we've been able to create new IP on the platform, and that's why I think new IP is going to continue to be possible on the platform. I guess what I'm saying is that as the skills of creating games which distribute themselves socially on the platform evolves and becomes understood by the franchise owners moving forward, all other things equal, the brands will have at least as good an opportunity as new IP. And because a brand that spends, tens of millions of dollars in advertising outside of the social network has a certain recognition, I think you will see that when you pit those two things, put them right side by side, typically franchises have had an advantage. That's certainly been the case on other gaming platforms. You're right, distribution in this case is different, but even then, my expectation is that we're going to see a substantial amount of successful brands on social networks. Again, I don't think the whole network is going to be dominated by brands, but I think there's going to be a lot of very successful franchises on the social networks.
I see. Good point.
Thanks.
First of all, great presentation. Because games and playing games have been such a part of childhood, do you see social games moving into the children's space? And if so, is Playfish and EA interested in doing that?
So the question is whether kids will end up playing social games. So I think actually, I think they will. I mean, there are some great social gaming experiences like a game called Moshi Monsters, for example, by Mind Candy, which is a great, which is a social gaming experience, designed for kids. I think what we need to be mindful of as an industry is that because we get people to play together, we also have a certain responsibility to protect that play experience. And even if it is with real-world friends, I think there are some very valid and good regulatory reasons why we've got to be a little bit more careful with how kids play games with each other and with strangers than how adults play games together. So I do think that social gaming will absolutely be there at the low end of the market, and I think you will see a lot of companies being interested in developing products for that.
Are you one of those companies?
We haven't announced any products in that area.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
How do you see Playfish and other social gaming companies becoming less dependent on Facebook over the next couple of years? Are there other actual distribution outlets? And maybe along those lines, how does EA's distribution network help you and vice versa?
Yeah, so the question is, how we see ourselves becoming less dependent on Facebook and, how we can leverage EA's distribution network. Well, firstly, I think Facebook is increasingly becoming a utility, and they even think of themselves in some way as a utility out there. So in the same way as we're kind of all somewhat dependent on power companies as games developers, right? If we don't get power, people can't play games. We are always dependent on some infrastructure utility providers in order to provide us with something we can't provide ourselves, in our case, friend relationships. I think the direction that Facebook has taken so far, and done it very well, is to make sure that they expose that information, and they are very focused on Facebook Connect, which enables that information to go outside of the social network in such a way that because there is economies of scale in creating social graphs, because it's more valuable when there's more people on it. There's network effects, if you like. We actually see Facebook as being a key provider of that utility service moving forward. So we're actually not that focused on, if you like, trying to figure out how to get away from Facebook, because Facebook has brought us 200 million monthly uniques over the past 2 years, and I think that's something. That said, I do believe in choice. I think people choose to be on different social networks for a reason, because different social networks have different flavors to them. And in general, the internet evolves very quickly, and consumer preferences evolve very quickly. So where people will choose to map their friend relationships in the future, who knows? All we want and all we are interested in is to make sure that we can tap into those friend relationships moving forward. And as to answer quickly the second part of the question on how we can leverage EA's distribution network, I think what EA brings to us and why we are so excited about being part of the EA family is, one, having access to some of the most loved brands in the game industry. I think it's really tantalizing, the idea of how would you extend that experience, what would that experience be like on social networks, but also because EA is so global and we're able to tap into more local, if you like, execution in different countries, and also then be able to perhaps look at some of the IP that we've created on social networks and take those out of social networks. So I think, into other platforms. I think all those things are pretty exciting, and it's, why we're excited about this. I think we've got time for literally 2 more quick questions.
I just have a quick question. Do you think that the free type business model with either microtransactions or virtual currency is compatible at all with gamers that are more used to a traditional experience, like on consoles, or like paying up front for one product, one time?
So the question is the free-to-play experience compatible with games with core gamers, effectively? So I think it is. I think, though, that core gamers don't necessarily need to be served the product for free always. I think there's a really big case for high-end products which have a pretty high upfront fee, which then have some downloadable content that you can pay even more for. I think the trick is, when we think of consumers, is really to understand, who are you as a consumer and what are you interested in buying. For some people, paying $60 for a game is not a barrier. They know that the next BioWare title will be brilliant and they'll buy it, so hence, they're willing to, put money. It doesn't mean that you need to then make that title free. I think the idea is that by lowering the barriers and providing access to games for free, or providing this free-to-play experience, we can broaden our appeal as an industry, and we can then get more people who are confident enough to be able to then pay up front and pay over time in other products.
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks. Last one.
This is another question about brands. Obviously, yesterday, we learned that 70% of Facebook users are non-U.S. users. Facebook's very much a global community, and I realize that EA is a very much a global company. But for certain brands like Madden, most of the world doesn't care about football outside of the U.S., etc. So how do you feel that the global markets might care about some of the brands like NFL, Modern Warfare, etc. How do you feel that branding will work in such a global market?
Great. So the question is about how will brands work in a global market when some brands are clearly local. So I think there's actually 2 things going on there. One is our execution as an industry is still predominantly global, which is kind of interesting, because almost any other game market, certainly true for the mobile games market, there used to be different top 10s in almost every country, because there's titles that actually appeal more to the local cultural, whatever happens to be hot in that place at that time. I think we haven't yet evolved as an industry to a place where we're actually very good at serving markets individually. So I think there's tons of opportunity there to create local titles, and I think the local, still the US population of Facebook, even if it is only say 30%, that's still, out of 200 million, that's 60 million monthly actives. There's still quite a lot of players. So I think you will see, a lot of local execution as well as global execution moving forward on brands. I think that's our last question. We're definitely out of time. So thank you very much. Appreciate you coming, and thank you.